Today is October 11th, 2011. My name is Tony Hilliard, and I'm here with Roger Sosette at the Atlanta History Center in Atlanta, Georgia, where we are volunteers. With us is Mr. Joe Byrd, a veteran of the Vietnam War, who has agreed to share his experience with us during his tour of duty in the U.S. Navy. This interview is being recorded for the Library of Congress's Veterans History Project through the efforts of the Atlanta Vietnam Veterans Business Association. Mr. Byrd, would you tell us your full name and address, please?
Okay, my full name is Joseph Pitts Byrd IV.
Okay. Can you give us your date of birth and tell us a little bit about your life growing up?
Okay. I was born in Savannah, Georgia. Proud to be a seventh generation Georgian on both sides of my family. My date of birth was July 12th, 1943. So I was right before the baby boomer generation and right after the generation that remembers the Depression, so sort of in between the two generations. I grew up in my father's adopted town, hometown of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I lived there until I was almost 9, and we moved to Colorado, and I went through the rest of my school there in Colorado. When I graduated from high school in 1961, I decided to attend the University of Colorado. The summer that I graduated, after I graduated, our family moved to Texas. My younger brother and sister enrolled in school there in Texas. That fall, I went to the University of Colorado for 2 years and transferred to Stephen F. Austin, which is in Nacogdoches, Texas. I finished my college education at Stephen F. Austin. And in 1965, I enlisted in the Navy. My academic record at that time was not very stellar, and I dropped out of college for a semester to work and live at home. And I decided to enlist in the Navy, and joined the Navy in a reserve unit there in Lufkin, Texas, where my family had moved, and finished up my college at Stephen F. Austin. I applied for an appointment to Officer Candidate School. I didn't think I had a very good chance, but I did work very hard to get my grades back up, and I was blessed in my family. I had, on both sides of my family, connections in Georgia with the two most powerful political men in Congress with regard to the armed forces. That would be Senator Richard Russell and Congressman Carl Vinson. My grandfather and great-grandfather were very actively involved in Georgia politics and were personal friends of Carl Vinson. And on my father's side, my great-grandfather and grandfather knew Dick Russell. So I guess I was fortunate in that they stood up for me, and I got notice of my appointment to OCS in January of 1967, my last semester, starting my last semester in college. So they let me go from the reserve unit, and I prepared to go to OCS right after I graduated from college.
Where was OCS?
I went to Newport, Rhode Island. And I was there at the beginning of the nice dorms and at the end of the splinter barracks. There was one company, Charlie Company, I remember, that had the splinter barracks, and the rest of us were in those beautiful new residence halls there at OCS. It was a great experience for me. It was 18 weeks, and New England in the early fall and summer is a great place to be. So I enjoyed that experience very much. It was very intense.
Would you like to show that picture?
Well, this is what I looked like. None the worse for the wear when I got out of OCS. Actually, I hadn't gotten my commission, but they took our pictures with the ensign bars on the shoulders there. So that was what I looked like back in those days.
What time of the year did you get through, in the fall?
I started in June and got out at the end of October, and everybody made a dash for the Providence Airport, which required some finagling on flights, and you had to go all the way around Narragansett Bay to get to the airport. Most everybody flew out of there, and I had a great idea. Why not just take a plane across Narragansett Bay and be the first one to the airport to catch my plane? And so I went out to the little airport in Newport and flew over Narragansett Bay on the most beautiful day of the year. Cloudless sky, steel blue water, and trees at the peak of their colors. It's a very, very good mental image of getting my commission and moving on. I had, I think, a week after OCS before I went to Athens, Georgia for supply school. That was my next stop, Athens, Georgia. I guess my eyes were too bad to be a line officer. You had to have good vision for that. So I was fortunate to get in the supply corps, and so I started supply officer school in Athens, Georgia around the 1st of November. And Athens was also a great place to be. I enjoyed it very much. All this time I had been corresponding with my college sweetheart, who I was engaged to, and I had only seen her since I graduated from college, the 7 days that I had off after OCS. And we planned a wedding, and I got Christmas leave from supply school. We got married after Christmas and before New Year's, before I had to be back to supply school.
In Georgia?
In Georgia.
Okay.
She was a native of Dallas. I had met her at college when I was in Texas, and we drove down to Athens from Dallas with a little U-Haul trailer behind us, and set up an apartment over by the University of Georgia. I was at supply officer school until I think around the 1st of June in '68, and got another week of leave and met my ship in Long Beach. She went back to Dallas, and I was in Long Beach and San Diego before the ship went back to San Francisco.
What was the name of your ship?
I was on a repair ship. It was home ported at NAS Alameda. There are piers right at the end of the runway. We got to hear the jets every morning take off. We were, I think, one of 2 repair ships that sort of shuttled in and out of NAS Alameda, the piers there. The other was known as the Marquette, was the other repair ship. I was on the Delta. The ship had about 550 total complement. Wardroom had 25 or 30 officers. We had a number of warrant officers on the ship, and a lot of LDOs that had been formally enlisted that were very highly qualified in the different repair areas. We had 6 big repair divisions on the ship. I was one of 4 junior supply officers on the ship, and we had a lieutenant commander, supply officer, and an assistant who was a full lieutenant. The rest of the supply officers were ensigns and JGs. My first duty, I guess, was the food service officer. And on repair ships, it's not like being on a battleship or a combat ship where everything is spit and polished. it really reflects the type of work and the type of people that wind up on repair ships. And so we had a real challenge, I guess, to keep the mess decks clean and pass inspection, whenever we had that. I decided, since I was interested in marketing and marketing research at the time, that I would do a survey of the crew and find out what they wanted, Isn't that what you do, when you're the food service officer? And my bell was rung pretty good. When I got the responses back, I learned a lot more sailor profanity than I'd ever dreamed I would know when I went through it. And there was a good participation rate. I made sure all of the division CPOs made sure all of their men sent back that was probably a mistake.
Was this done anonymously?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Yes, it was. There was no name on any, although some bothered to put their name on it. But basically, 3 messages I gleaned from these 400 some odd surveys that the food service officer, the little ensign, the new ensign on the ship sends out. Steak, ice cream, and screw you, something like that. So I realized, okay, this isn't, I guess that you can't just say something or fail to salute an officer if it's in a real tight environment. But I realized then that this wasn't exactly the Navy that I had thought of or perceived of. But anyway, we tried to do our best, and we always loaded up with as many steaks as we could, as much on the ship as we could carry. That came in real handy when we went overseas, because everybody wanted to have steak, and we could trade in some cases with other ships. So that's how I started the first week on the ship. I think we were in Long Beach for about a month. Later on, my wife joined me at Alameda when we were there, but there were several times when we would get underway and go back to Long Beach or San Diego, where there was a lot more activity. So we didn't stay at Alameda that much of the time. And it didn't do too much to solidify our marriage. It was a very difficult time. My wife had really never been out of Texas that much in her life. Lived in Dallas most of her life, so it was a hard transition for her to make. So anyway, that was pretty much our routine. We while we were stateside on the West Coast. In '68, we did go a special trip up to Seattle. There's a Seafair festival every year in August, and we went up there, and the weather was absolutely perfect, and had a wonderful time there. Usually they put the combat ships there for display, but we were a substitute, I think, for another ship that couldn't go, so they got to see a repair ship along with the other combat ships that were there at Seafair. One thing that happened, wasn't the best thing, but it just goes to show you that no one's perfect, and if you don't go out to sea a lot, sometimes you get a little rusty. We got to the Straits there, entering the Straits up on the Washington coast, about, I guess 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock at night. And the ship had to put the sea and anchor detail on. That was a requirement once you got into inland waters. Well, it took a day almost to go from the Pacific Ocean to Seattle, where we were supposed to tie up at a berth. And we got to there about 5 o'clock in the evening or afternoon, in the, we didn't have a pier space, so we had never, since I'd been on the ship, I don't ever remember anchoring out. So we had to anchor in the bay. The deck force dropped the first anchor. It went to the bottom of Puget Sound. And the second anchor was dropped and it went to the bottom of Puget Sound. I'm not sure what the mathematical probability of that happening, but the whole community was watching the ships there. They had I think they even had a news helicopter circling around all the ships that had come in for seafare. And we were in the wardroom and turned on the TV for the 6 o'clock news, and there we were, a little human interest story about this repair ship that had come into Puget Sound and lost its anchors.
Oh, so when you say it went to the bottom, you mean it literally?
It literally went to the bottom, and that's a fairly deep water port, the position where we were in. That was very embarrassing. Well, we had an old Mustang, old guy named Charlie Brown. I couldn't tell you if he was 40 years old or 80 years old. He was an old salty guy. He'd been formerly enlisted. He was the first lieutenant on the ship. And he was a pretty hot guy around the collar when he got mad. And I've never seen a man so bent out of shape as the first lieutenant. Charlie Brown was his name. He's a lieutenant and been in World War II in Korea, and he was a little upset, to say the least. Well, that meant the sea and anchor detail had to stay on while the ship maneuvered back and forth and stay out of the way of everyone else until we got a pier berth the next morning. So they were up all night. They were up 2 nights, and I really felt for those guys, and I was really thankful that I was not on the sea and anchor detail. Now, supply officers on a lot of ships would not be standing bridge watch, but on our ship, all supply officers stood watch. Perhaps the head supply officer, the lieutenant commander, did not, but all the junior supply officers stood watch. So whenever we were out at sea, we would be the junior officer of the deck, and that would mean that the officer of the deck would come up, would say, "Mr. Byrd, you have the con," being the junior officer of the deck, and so then we were there on the bridge, just like a line officer would be. So that was an experience I had that not every supply officer has on their first assignment.
Can you just describe a little bit of what it was like to be the officer of the deck underway?
Underway, you are responsible for the ship and its maneuvering, your course. You have to stay on course. If there's any objects or other ships there, you're responsible for the rules of navigation. If you encounter another ship, staying away. Don't get in extremis where you can't, you can't maneuver out of the way. This was a real challenge when we were in the South China Sea, because there were just hundreds and hundreds of wooden ships out there that you can't pick up on the radar. And on a dark night, that's a little, it's a little stressful for whoever has that responsibility. If you want to, I guess if you want to bail, there's the officer of the deck who is supposed to be up there the whole time too. But that was a good experience for me to do that. There are also reports that come up to the officer of the deck, or the JOD, about the different divisions on the ship. But that's in a nutshell. You're responsible.
It's your ship.
That's right. As far as the orders are concerned for the direction of the ship and the engine room and everything. So that was something that we did. Fortunately, I was not on the bridge at that time, or I would have had to. There were 2 nights on the sea anchor detail before. We finally got into the pier at Seattle about 6 o'clock in the morning. And so that's something I remember. That was not, that was a pretty embarrassing time, I guess, for this ship. But repair ships, our duty is to be usually tied up to a pier and servicing other ships in places where there might not be a shipyard or where they need to come for repair parts. We had a company of divers on the ship. There was one Annapolis man in our wardroom, and he was the diving officer. He was a JG, had gotten out of Annapolis a couple of years before I came on board the ship. And they, I think there were about a dozen divers in his group. They mostly did hull inspections, did some repair work underwater, but they were mostly looking for hull problems on the ships, anything under the water. So, food service officer, stateside, my most memorable, let's see, we had a system of assigning mess cooks to the food service division on my ship, and I tried to lobby against it because it definitely worked against me. Every division on the ship, in proportion to their number, had to provide one or more mess cooks for the food service operation. And so, who do you think the leading chief or the division officer would assign to the mess decks? The absolute worst guy, the one they wanted to get rid of. And so I had, out of 33 mess cooks, about 25 incorrigibles that I had to deal with. They were temporarily assigned to me, and I had about 8 or 9 commissary men who were good fellows for the most part. So the whole time I spent as food service officer, every week I would go to the XO's inquiry because one or more of those mess cooks would get into trouble on the beach. And I had a lot of the same guys returning to me. They'd get transferred out of one division into another, and the first thing they would do would be to send that to me. So some of them, I can remember one guy had 3 different times for, I think they were assigned for either 60 or 90 days temporarily. That was a challenge, to say the least, with all those guys, keeping that place clean, keeping everybody happy on the ship. I was very proud of the general mess, and I always knew that we were doing a great job when I never had any trouble getting the other officers. They would come down and evaluate the meal three different times a day. Every meal the officer would show up, and I never had any trouble getting them to volunteer, and sometimes they would come down and have their meal there because it was better than whatever they were having in the wardroom. So I felt pretty good about at least keeping the people happy. And I had a great guy for a chief petty officer who ran the show, really. I just was sort of, I don't know, window dressing. He was 28 years in the service. I think he enlisted before the beginning of World War II, and was a senior chief petty officer, and just a big guy. You just imagine a guy with a smile on his face all the time, consistently getting in trouble for being overweight and having to, I don't know, go on a diet or whatever. but he didn't do very much of that. But, that was a good experience. On my ship, we had these 4 junior supply officers, and we sort of rotated positions. One would take the ship store, another would take the supply division, the disbursing office. That was my next assignment after food service. Right before we went overseas in '69, I was assigned the responsibility for the disbursing office. I had 3 enlisted men, and I also had the responsibility for all the stewards on the ship. I had 18 Filipino stewards, 1 black guy, and a senior chief Filipino who had been in the Navy, I think, since the middle of the Roosevelt era. He predated World War II as well, Chief Delgado. And so that was a very interesting opportunity to connect culturally and try to nurture these guys' careers, because these were all really good fellows, these stewards, and they just wanted to make a career of the Navy, and it was very difficult because they were all trying to make petty officer. The ones that weren't, or the third-class petty officers, were always they were studying all the time. I wish all the guys on the ship had been that conscientious, but it was difficult because so many of them would try for a promotion, and they could only take so many. Mm-hmm. So I know that they were frustrated about not being able to advance, perhaps as rapidly as they would if they were in another rating other than the steward's rating. So a lot of them would break out, and I had a first-class petty officer who was a Filipino disbursing clerk. He was just a terrific guy. Couldn't have done it without him.
The disbursing officer function has to do with pay, or?
Paymaster.
Paymaster, okay.
Right. And then there are other financial or monetary documents in addition to paying the crew that have to be maintained in the disbursing office as well. And then there is the matter of handling cash, petty cash on the ship. There's also the post office. You know, we had that responsibility, and just keeping track of all of this money. When I left to go overseas, I recall I had over $660,000 in cash to pay the crew on the ship. You know, it was one thing stateside. I had some paydays there that went pretty easily because it was all U.S. currency. But when we went overseas, we had to get money exchanged and pick up the local currency to keep the U.S. currency off the black market. And then in Vietnam, there was a special case, and you, if you were there, you may remember funny money, MPC, military paid currency, I think is. So we had to deal with that, and it wasn't as strong and durable as other currency, and if you got hot and wet, that stuff would start to disintegrate. And so I had to keep track of all of that with my disbursing clerks there, and hold a payday. And then in other cases we could pay in U.S. currency, but that was just on the ship. Being a Navy supply officer and having access to the currency, I was called out to pay other ships. Coast Guard ship. I was on an Australian ship, in paying, in the foreign currency. These were smaller ships that did not have dedicated supply officers who had access to foreign currency. So
This was in Vietnam? In
Yes.
the Vietnam area? Okay.
and this, not just Vietnam, but overseas, mostly in Vietnam, yes.
When did you go?
I was there in '69, and right in the middle of the cruise. My ship was overseas for 9 months, I think at least 9 months. I actually came back to the States from the Philippines before the end of the cruise. That was in October when we were there. But that was, yeah, the Philippines was a real problem. There was a lot of counterfeit money, and get a 18-year-old kid in Longapo or Subic Bay, somewhere around there, off the base, and they're going to wind up, in some cases, with counterfeit money, and that would come in, and we would have to have an investigation anytime we uncovered counterfeit money that came back on the ship. So it was a challenge, to say the least. I was just so happy to, keep everything pretty much intact during the time I was overseas, because I was dispersing officer that whole almost 9 months.
What would happen if what came up short?
Navy dispersing officers are accountable. It means they're accountable for the money, whether it's a small amount or a couple $100 or a large amount, and they are expected to make good. That's just another responsibility you have on your shoulders as a supply officer.
So you spent time in the Philippines?
Yes.
Did you transit
Two.
between the Philippines and
Yes.
Vietnam? Is that what you did?
We went to Taiwan first, Kaohsiung. Then I think we went after that to the Philippines, to Subic Bay, and I think Hong Kong, and then we were in Sasebo, Japan, and back to Hong Kong a second time, and the Philippines a second time, and then in the middle of all of that we were in Vietnam at Vung Tau. There was no pier facility for us there, so we anchored out, and there were different types of river craft and landing boats. I think they called them mike boats that we would ride ashore. That was a challenge for me because there was no Navy dispersing office in Vung Tau. Everything was there. The Navy was there, the Air Force, the Australians were there, the Army was there. It was a little bit of everything around Vung Tau. But I had to go to Cat Lo, which required a armed craft to get up there, and that would be a PBR, maybe a John Kerry type craft that I think he was at Cat Lo for a while. I never ran into him there, but I do remember reading about that. There was a Navy Seabee base there.
Was this on the Saigon River?
Saigon River, yes. So I would have to negotiate with a PBR. They would frequently come out to the ship. Now, I don't ever remember having to get one dispatched or anything like that because they knew we had a ship store, so they could come in. So we had visitors coming in, so I would say, you going back to Cat Lo? And if I couldn't get back on a PBR to go back to the ship, I would have to go to I think there was a little port place there at Vung Tau where I could get a mike boat to go back. But that meant going from Cat Lo to Vung Tau.
You want to show that picture?
Well, this is on a mike boat, and I don't believe that's the Delta. It's another ship that was anchored out at Vung Tau. I've got a bunch of other ones that I would like to share, but that is my camera taking a picture of the guys. Some of the fellows stationed around there. Some of the fellows were from the ship that I was on. We usually could get a mite boat out to the ship pretty easily. I don't ever remember waiting more than maybe a half an hour, 45 minutes for transportation. And if there was an Army vehicle going to Vung Tau, we would just hitch a ride. I think about we might have been in danger, but Vung Tau was a fairly secure area. The joke was that the VC had an R&R center there at Vung Tau, and they were not interested in fighting. I don't know if that was true or not, but I had to go with my first. I always took my first class with me. We always had 45s, and we had a lock box that would, I guess they'd have to cut my arm off to get the money out of there.
Did you ever have interactions with the local Vietnamese? I mean, or in terms of business, or was everything through the U.S. Navy supply chain?
Given the fact that we weren't on the pier and there wasn't a place that we could sort of embark from there, my time was very limited, and there was so many places that I had to go for payday that I really didn't have the opportunity that I had when I was in Japan or Philippines or even Taiwan to interact with the local business community. In fact, I don't think I went to a commercial establishment while I was in Vung Tau the whole time I was there. We were there about 2 months. But I was, I enjoyed interacting with the people in all of the other countries. Hong Kong was a very special place for us.
Let me ask you a question about the ship itself. I mean, you're either tied up or at anchor in Vung Tau.
Right.
Were there places on the ship that were air conditioned, or were you?
Some were and some weren't. I had a couple of different staterooms. It was a big enough ship with enough. They had 2 levels. The senior officers were on one level and the junior officers were on another. I did have rooms with roommates. I also had a room by myself, which was, pretty good. Unfortunately, the room that I had was not air conditioned. And when we were in the Philippines, I remember I never could go to sleep at night. It was too hot. So I would go up to the wardroom that had air conditioning. I would lie down on the couch until I fell asleep, and then I would get very sleepy and sort of stagger back to my room, and I would be able to sleep a little bit, but not very good. I asked for an air conditioner. I was on a bulkhead. My room was. They said that will create some problems, but they went ahead and took an acetylene torch, cut through there, and put a unit air conditioner in my room. So the last, 2 weeks I was there, I had air conditioning in that room. But I remember it would be 100 degrees or more in my stateroom because of the heat on that metal bulkhead, probably more than anything else. And I had fans in there, but they didn't do any good. So that was, it was not very comfortable, to say the least. The one thing I remember about the ship was that the mess caterer's office was right around the corner from my stateroom, where the steward, the chief steward was in there, and he had another fellow. It was enough room for about 2 guys comfortably. It was a small area, but it was midships on a fairly high level. The stewards all were in the front compartment of the ship, which was near the bow. And when we would go into seas, head into the seas, it would be like being on a runaway elevator. The ship motion going up and down. And unfortunately, these guys, although they were all in the Navy and probably wanted to make careers of it, were very prone to seasickness. sleeping in that compartment, it just was not possible. And I know how bad they were because they would come up in the wardroom and try to serve us, and they would look at the food and run out and throw up over the side of the ship. And of course I had responsibility for them, and we're, you know, in the heavy seas, you know, where's my soup, you know? And so anyway, one night I was making the rounds, and I was walking through the junior officers' area of the ship, boys' country, and I heard this moan and groan and everything. Oh, just it was the eeriest sound. I went over and I listened and heard the moaning and groaning coming out of the ship's steward office, and I opened the mess cater office door, and there were about 16 Filipinos stewards in there, all just moaning and groaning. But it was not as bad a part of the ship. It was sort of midships, and they weren't on that elevator ride going up and down. And I just felt for those guys because not only were they sick, but they were just packed in there like cordwood, and trying to you know, ride out the storm. We encountered some very heavy seas in the Pacific at different times, but the worst, when that happened, we were just about a day out of San Francisco, past the Farallon Islands, and we just hit some really heavy seas. Everything in the dispersing office was, you know, tied down and battened down, and after 2 days, I didn't even go in the office. I was sick too, but I just went down there, and everything in the office, everything was on the floor. Not one thing. That's how I thought we had done a good job of tying that stuff down. But that's you know, heavy seas, rough seas. So I had a good taste of that out in the Pacific.
So you were heading back to the States at that time?
We were en route to Pearl Harbor, actually, which was a stopover before we went to Westpac. Yeah. I was, yeah, like I said, I think that was the only time I was really sick. 2 days there. The rest of the time I did pretty good. I was fortunate, though. Most of the time we had some good weather and good seas going over there. My father, on the other hand, was in the northern Pacific, and he gets car sick going around the block. He just passed away last year, and he was in World War II, and I just can't imagine him. You know, you might have seen that show, what is it, the Dangerous Catch or whatever, where they're fishing.
Oh, yeah.
That's what his ship was in, around the Aleutian Islands, northern Pacific. So I was fortunate for that.
So when did you start heading back? Or when was
I had the I told you about my marriage. It's not going very good. I think I went 33 days without getting a letter from my wife. And I thought, there's a big red flag here. And then the content of the letters just deteriorated. She went back to Dallas after the ship went overseas. So she'd been there for months. And really, I was pretty stressed out to begin with. And then all of this sort of weighed pretty heavily on me. It was a good, quick weight loss program. About 30 pounds, I think I lost over there. So when we got to the Philippines, we'd been there for about 3 weeks. This was the second time we were there at Subic, and I got the offer, you can stay in for an extra year or get out a little early. Since I was a reserve officer, I had a commitment for 3 years of active duty, and so I came up with a decision at that point in time. My marriage was going down the tubes. My wife was in Dallas. Been overseas for 9 months, almost 9 months. It was really pretty worn out at that time, and I said, well, I'm just going to take the offer. I had the chance to stay in longer or get out earlier, so I did, and went back from the Philippines. I went up to Clark Air Force Base and waited around a couple of days for a flight back. Flew back to Travis by way of Japan, and I think I spent about 5 or 6 days there in the Bay Area, maybe a week at Treasure Island. That was the last I was there on active duty. Went back to Dallas. The marriage did not work out. Within about 3 months, we were separated, and in less than a year, we were divorced. So, and it all hit about the same time. 9 months overseas, coming back, adjusting to civilian life without any really preparation. I just sort of made that decision on the spur of the moment. No job prospects, adjusting to civilian life, adjusting to life back in the country. Yeah, the world had changed since I graduated from college and came back at the end of 1969 to the United States. It's a hard time for me.
When you got back to the States, you came off active duty?
I did.
And you went into the reserves, or you?
I did, yes.
Okay.
I didn't go in immediately. I put in for a paid billet, and I was very fortunate. After a couple months, got into a Navy supply officer unit that met out at Bachman Lake, which is near NAS Dallas, Naval Air Station Dallas. And we had a commitment to drill every week, but we didn't have weekends off. We were able to do this during the week in the evening, and then a 2-week commitment for a cruise. I stayed in that unit until the middle of 1972. So from the time I enlisted in December of '65, when I was in college, until the end of June '72, most of the time I was either in active duty or in a Navy Reserve unit.
So you had occasion to wear your uniform
Every week.
Every week.
Right.
What was the reaction of the civilian community during
Well,
that
you know,
period?
it was okay in Dallas. I went at night. I guess when I had my uniform on all the time was when I was in Norfolk one time for a supply officer seminar on a 2-week cruise, and I was in Long Beach on an oiler for 2 weeks. The time when it would have been a sticky wicket, so to speak, was when I was in the Bay Area. But officers could dress in civilian clothes off the base, going off the base. I had my uniform on a couple of times, but I was mostly on the base there. But when I lived within walking distance of NAS Alameda Piers, so I would walk to work in my uniform, never had any trouble at Alameda. If I'd gone up to Berkeley or something, I'm sure I would have been harassed pretty good. It was only 20 minutes from Berkeley, maybe. I was there. The attitude was pretty antagonistic toward men in uniform. You guys may have experienced that. I was fortunate in that I never had a really bad confrontation, but virtually everybody I knew had some sort of, disrespectful behavior aimed in your direction.
You mentioned just a few minutes earlier about how the world changed. Do you
Right.
want to just elaborate
Well,
on that a little?
when I went into the Navy, I had these little narrow lapel and little narrow ties and everything, and when I got out, there were, you know, there's no such thing as bell-bottom pants in Nacogdoches, Texas, probably. So everybody looked different. Everybody had about 10 times as much hair as they did. And the attitudes were, okay, we're young, the world is changing, we're going to be a part of this. And everything, counterculture was cool, supposedly. And I really went through a lot in my mind, and just, I was sort of torn in two directions about that. As it turned out, I wised up. By the time McGovern ran for president, I think I was pretty much grounded by that time. I had met my wife the year after I divorced, and that was the best thing that ever happened to me. If I'd been married to her when I was in the Navy, she would have supported me 100%. She was just true blue, and it would have made a lot of difference than having someone who really didn't.
Well, what about your life, you know, since then? I mean, how?
Oh, well, I've grown to love this country much more. I've grown to appreciate the freedoms that we have. And I think every year I gain more and more respect for men in uniform. And I was there at a time when the draft was in effect, and a lot of guys on a repair ship had stood before a judge. And the judge had said, son, it's either military or you're going to go to jail. That was very common. There are a lot of those guys that wound up on a repair ship and did not have the best attitude. It's tough enough today to come back and make the adjustment. Back then, there were a lot of counter forces involved in everything. It had a lot to do with the discipline on the ship. The drugs were a big problem back then. Imagine being off the coast of China with all those wooden boats that you can't pick up on a radar, and your petty officer comes in and there's some seaman out on the bridge on watch, and he said, this guy's got X's over his eyes. I think he's stoned out of his mind. Let's get somebody up here and make sure they're, you know, cognizant. You don't want to be in a position like that with somebody who's not. So could I, time? Well, you ask about any friends I met or made when I was in the Navy, and there are two that come to mind who've been lifelong friends. I saw one just the other day. I went out to Colorado and visited with him, and we had a wonderful visit out there. He had a whole bunch of pictures that we looked at. We were in OCS together, Supply Officer School together, and we were fraternity brothers. So I don't know, we were good friends to begin with, but after the Navy we became lifelong friends. I think having had that shared experience. And he was truly a friend. He helped me get my first real job after I got out of the Navy. I went to work for the city planning department in Dallas, Texas. Never forget, I was working at Neiman Marcus for $2.25 an hour in a sound and camera shop in a downtown store, and he came in, he'd just gotten out of the Navy, and he mentioned that he had taken a position with the city of Dallas. He had his master's degree in city planning, so he got me a job there, and I'll never forget that. And we were very close when we went through.
What was his name?
Tim Hines.
Tim Hines?
H-E-I-N-S, yeah. He's from Dallas, Dallas native, but he's lived in Colorado most of his life since he got out of the Navy. He was in Dallas for a few years and then went out to Colorado, and he's an adopted son of Colorado. That's where I grew up, not far from where he lives. I have another friend, and I would love for you guys to interview him because he had a much more colorful Navy career than I did. He was the supply officer on an LST, and I ran into him 3 times when we were overseas, which is really incredible since you know, an LST and a repair ship don't necessarily go to the same places. He was a native of Portland, Oregon, and he married a girl from the University of Georgia when we were at supply school. That's when they met, and they married later on. He spent 6 months of the year here in the fall and the spring down in middle Georgia around Macon, not far from Macon. They have about 500-acre farm there, and summers and winters in Portland. And, so I get to see him a lot.
What's his name?
His name is Don Crom, and he is one of the brightest guys I've ever known. He went to Brown University in Providence, so he was pretty much at home there when we were at OCS. And Tim Hines is from the University of Texas. And those guys, you know, I consider them 2 of my best friends, and I think they were good friends to begin with and became great friends when we had those shared experiences in the Navy. That's what really cemented our friendship.
As we move toward the end of the interview, what we always do is say, you know, in terms of a final comment, or, you know, any specific comment about your perspective on anything, the war or your experience.
Over the years, as I have grown in my, you know, knowledge of this country, and as I have really embraced history as a passion in my life, I realized that I was doing something that was good and not neutral or negative. And I'm proud of what I did. I'm not sure I can articulate my thoughts that well when I was in the service or when I got out, but the perspective has come with time and maturity. And I love my country, and I'm very proud of the role that the military has played, especially today. We're talking all volunteers. There were a lot of guys that were drafted back in my time that really made it kind of a lot rougher probably than it should have been. They just didn't want to be where they wanted to be, and it's hard to deal with that, I guess, because I wanted to have a good record, and I wanted to serve my time. I had a different attitude, but I can't help but say I was affected by that at the time I was in the Navy. I'm also thankful for the opportunity that I had to go to graduate school. My wife, my dear wife of 40 years, and I started out life, inherited a daughter and adopted her from her previous marriage. We didn't have 2 nickels to rub together. We bought our first house in Decatur, Georgia, on a VA loan with no money down, because we didn't have any money to put down on that home. And I got my master's degree, my MBA at Georgia State University, and I was very, very thankful and proud to receive the GI Bill benefits to go through school. And so I can't help but say, you know, that helped us get started in life, and helped me get really started in my career. I got my MBA in marketing, and I had a very successful career working for marketing research. In the last 12 years I spent at UPS in marketing research, and just very thankful for that.
Well, we appreciate your spending your time and just relating your experience to us. We want to thank you for that. We also want to thank you for your service and say welcome home.
Thank you. Good to be here.